over pre-contemplation and the seeds of change. This is found in DiClemente's book. It's chapter 7. We're also going to be going over the SAMHSA competencies 9 through 17. To get started, we're going to provide you guys with a brief overview of the competencies. And so I will be sharing the first part of it, and then David will be going over the following ones. And with these competencies, they're national guidelines for addiction and counseling. And so we're going to use them to show how we can respond effectively to clients in the pre-contemplation stage, especially when they seem stuck or unmotivated. So starting off with number 9, which is clinical evaluation. And so this is used to assess the stage of change that they're in and their needs. And moving on to number 10, which is helping strategies, which is more used to match the client with client-centered approaches. And then we're going to move on to the third one, which, number 11, which is treatment planning. And then this is really more so about meeting your client where they're at and tailoring interventions to meet their specific needs. So we're matching our strategy to their stage of change and recovery. Number 12 is cultural competence. And this is making sure that your client feels heard and respected, taking into account their culture and making sure that we're showing respect for our client's culture. And I'll go ahead and turn over the time to David.
All right, competency 13 is flexible modalities. It's to adapt treatment to the setting, place, and the needs of each client to avoid a rigid one-size-fits-all model to meet them wherever they're at and whatever their needs are. And competency 14 is co-occurring disorders. To consider mental health, trauma, and medical conditions is interacting with the substance use, and don't treat issues in isolation. We have to take all of them into account. Competency 15 is access to care. Clients can't engage if they face barriers like housing and insurance and transportation. We have to stay up to date and informed of all these resources to be able to help them in any of these situations. And competency 16 is crisis moments. Crisis can create opportunity, but only if a client feels safe and not pressured. And competency 17 is psychoeducation. Use education to empower, not to shame. The goal is to help clients understand their patterns without any judgment.
Awesome. So we just want to briefly look at what we're going to be covering today. So this is just a roadmap or an overview of the slides that we're going to be presenting. So we're going to start off with pre-contemplation, what that looks like, and what it's trying to protect. So a lot of the times in this stage, the client is not isn't just in denial. There's often some rooted fear or emotional overwhelm that we need to address. We're also going to be looking at the 5 R's. So these are defensive patterns or strategies that they use to and it prevents them from getting out of the pre-contemplation stage. Then we're going to look at the role of context, cultures, and systems in shaping readiness, and then why clients can be in multiple stages at once. We're also going to look at strategies that work as far as getting the client out of the pre-contemplation change stage, and then also strategies that don't work. And we're going to be applying all of this to a specific case study with Peter, and David's going to provide us a little bit of information on that.
Okay, the case study of Peter. He's a 40-year-old male that has a history of long-term drug use. It started in college with marijuana at a younger age and evolved into heroin use and later in life. He's experienced job loss. He lost his marriage. And even when he lost a job, he started using heroin and ended up working for a drug dealer and using his career in that aspect. He claims he can quit anytime, but he still continues to use in secret. He struggles with anxiety, insomnia, and emotional dependence on cannabis. He's in the pre-contemplation stage of change for emotional dependence, trauma, and internal motivation, ambivalent about his identity as a functioning user. He displays most of all 5 R's, but the dominant R's that we could find is rationalization. I only smoke because I'm stressed and reveling. He sees cannabis as a primary way to cope and feel good in his life. Um, so that'll move us into slide 5, which is pre-contemplation. I don't have a problem. Individuals in this stage are not considering change and have no intention of stopping their substance use within the next 6 months. And this stage is not about laziness or defiance. It reflects a protective psychological stance. A person may genuinely believe change isn't needed. They often feel that their behavior is helping them cope, or it's essential to who they are. And the substance use to them feels normal and deeply embedded in their identity and routine and of their everyday life. The psychological features in this stage, denial is not about dishonesty. It's about a survival logic. People may sincerely believe this isn't a real problem, or I can stop if I really want to, or others are worse off than me. Their decisional balance is skewed. They perceive more benefits from continuing the behavior than the risk or consequence of stopping. The self-efficacy is distorted. It's either inflated, like I can quit anytime, or defeated, like there's no point, I'll just fail again. The clinical behaviors in pre-contemplation, rationalizing or minimizing substance use, focusing on general problems like my job's stressful, or my marriage is stressful, or life is stressful. Um, they'll avoid conversations about change. They'll comply only to avoid punishment, like court-ordered treatment, probation, and things of that nature. Expressing false confidence or hopeless resignation. A clinical approach in this stage is to not be confrontational, argue, or to pressure the client or coerce the client, to focus instead on building trust and rapport, listening for subtle signs of doubt or internal conflict, um, and gently raising consciousness through reflection or non-judgmental dialogue. Um, in this stage, the clinician's role is to support the person's readiness and not to demand a change.
All right, and then we're going to be looking at the 5 R's of pre-contemplation and why change often feels impossible. So the 5 R's, they are basically protective mechanisms or strategies that clients often use to avoid change. And it's not anything to do with laziness, it's more so to protect themselves against feeling shame or discomfort. So DiClemente explains that most people use more than 1 R at a time. And yeah, and so we're going to be going over those. So there's reveling, which is when a client enjoys the behavior, they see no downside in their substance use. So our job is not to argue, but to raise gentle awareness of the long-term impacts. Then we have reluctance, which is yeah, so they fear discomfort, and it feels safer to stay in the patterns that they're familiar with. So the fear of change outweighs the cost of staying the same. Then we're going to look at rebellion, which is when a client resists pressure and they value control and autonomy. So they want to be able to have control over their decisions. And then there's resignation, which is when the client feels hopeless or powerless to change. So this is often the result of trauma, burnout, or even failed attempts at trying to recover. And rationalization is when a person minimizes harm or explains away their behavior. So they justify their use. And so in this specific situation, instead of challenging them, we should use motivational interviewing to allow space for them to reflect without any feelings of judgment or shame.
Okay, in slide 7, it's context of change, distraction versus focus. In chapter 7, DiClemente emphasizes that addiction never develops in a vacuum. People use substances in context of trauma, mental health issues, relationship patterns, housing instability, or cultural pressure. Often these external life problems become the focus while addiction hides behind the problems. And this is where I can reference competency 11, and it comes into tailoring care to the client's stage of change in their environment. If we refer back to the case study um, about Peter, he talks about his stress and anxiety as the real issue. And he says things like, if I could sleep, I would not need to smoke. But he avoids talking about the emotional dependence on cannabis. Um, the clinical implications um, is as clients, our task is to connect the dots. We help the client see that the addiction is not separate from the other problems, but is part of the same system. Um, Again, I'll reference competency 12. It reminds us to consider cultural identity and communication style. The client's story might not sound like avoidance at first. And then competency 14 reminds us that co-occurring disorders often blur the picture. Anxiety, depression, and trauma can mask or complicate the addiction. Um, people rarely in the same stage of change are rarely in the same stage of change across all areas of addiction or mental health. Um, yeah, and as DiClemente says, we must treat what's actually happening, not what we assume is true based on surface level insight.
Yeah, and so along with what David mentioned, so clients are not always they may be ready to change one of their behaviors, but maybe they're not ready to change another. So for example, a client that uses both alcohol and marijuana may be in the contemplation stage for their marijuana use, but they're in pre-contemplation when it comes to alcohol. So the Clemente makes it clear that people don't move through the stages of change in a clean, unified way. And so this is also what he calls readiness mismatch. So, and then traditional models often focus on one addiction at a time instead of looking at it as a like as a bigger system. And there's a few consequences or negative things when it comes to that. So programs that focus on a single addiction may falsely assume readiness applies to all substances. The client may appear engaged in treatment while continuing other forms of substance use that reinforces their addictive thinking or behaviors. So the pre-contemplation can be masked by survival needs or other priorities. And it's also important, in addition to that, to think about how other systems impact a client's readiness. So this can be things like survival stressors or societal stressors. So things like housing insecurity, poverty, medical issues, trauma history. So all of that needs to be taken into account.
Okay, slide 9 is what doesn't work in pre-contemplation, especially when we're talking about labeling someone as resistant can actually lock them into their role. Um, Clients in pre-contemplation often already feel vulnerable or misunderstood, and confronting them, even when we have good intentions, amplifies shame and defensiveness. And nagging, pressuring, or labels, they'll usually backfire. So when we say things like you're in denial, clients often shut down or become oppositional. And these labels can solidify self-protective patterns. Um, Focusing on logic over emotion, a lot of times we'll miss the point. Facts about brain chemistry or relapse stats won't help until clients have connected emotionally. Peter might intellectually agree cannabis isn't ideal, but emotionally feels it's necessary for him to function. If we want an example of that, that's what Peter's doing. Change begins with safety and reflection, and not with force or coercion. So this is a foundation for all of our work in pre-contemplation. Now, reference competency 10 to avoid coercion and lean on motivational questioning, motivational strategies. And competency 11, again, we kind of hammered on aligning care with the stage of change that somebody's in. And just to remember that clients need space to reflect, and that space isn't for them to defend themselves, it's for them to feel safe and find that reflection, and for us to make that space for them.
And then, so what does work in pre-contemplation? So, according to DiClemente, change begins when people feel safe enough to explore. So our job is not to push them to change. It's to help them feel safe and to open that door to allow them to change. And this is where motivational interviewing comes in. So this approach is grounded in respect, empathy, and collaboration. And we ask open-ended questions and is going to help the client what reflect back and highlight any ambivalence. Um, yeah, and so along with that, it's also going to help build emotional safety and autonomy. And in the case of Peter, so Peter rationalizes his cannabis use by focusing on how it helps with his anxiety or it helps him sleep. So if we confront Peter about his use, he might be on the defense and he might justify his use. So what we want to he might even become more avoidant or he might comply but without being genuine about it. So what he needs instead is gentle guided self-evaluation that lets him explore how his current coping strategies may be failing him over time. And
Okay, thank you. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Sorry, Maria.
oh, it's okay. So that's basically the end of our presentation. We included our references, and then we also included a handout and over